Like you said, my name is Andy Mark, and I'm the author of 2 books. The first book was titled The West Branch Mill Sierra Lumber Company, Early Logging in Northeastern California. It was published by the History Press in 2012. And the second book is Stories of the Humboldt Wagon Road, again published by the History Press, this time in 2020. Now, I write about the Big Chico Creek V-FLUME in both of those books, but I have different stories in each one. And today I'd like to share some of my knowledge about the Big Chico Creek V-FLUME with you. And also at the end, if we have time, I'd like to talk about 2 other lesser known V-FLUMEs that were in Butte County. While they're in operation, V-FLUMEs fascinated many people back then, and their history still does today. And so I'm hoping this presentation will you'll find this little presentation interesting yourself about the V-FLUME. But before we go further, I'd like to thank the Nopal family and Randy Taylor, I don't see Randy Taylor here anywhere, for donating or loaning some of these great historical photos of the FLUME to Chico State University, who was able to digitalize them and make them available for people like me. So let's move on. Okay, when the V-FLUME was first introduced to the hills east of in northeastern California, it revolutionized the lumber industry. Lumber no longer had to be transported from the higher elevations of the valley below using slow, plodding beasts of burden, pulling heavy wagons weighted down with stacks of sliced up wood over rutty and bumpy dirt roads. Instead, it could be accomplished by flowing the wood down a specially designed waterway called a V-FLUME. And this reduced the transportation costs considerably for the lumber companies, and they were able to pass that savings on to the consumer. Now, in November of 1872, a new joint stock company was formed to do just that down Big Chico Creek Canyon. And in May of 1873, the Butte Flume and Lumber Company filed a certificate of incorporation with the Secretary of State. And in late in the summer of 1874, the first big run of lumber came down the Big Chico Creek Flume. It was 100,000 feet. So now the FLUME originated at a place called the Cascade Mill that was up on Cascade Creek. It was a tributary of Big Chico Creek. And it snaked its way down Big Chico Creek Canyon for 33 miles before it ended at a place called the Dump on the edge of the valley. It was later called the Old Dump, and there was a town there. They changed their name to Oakvale also. But it didn't go all the way into Chico. At that point, like I said, it was only 33 miles long. The last 3 to 3.5 miles was owned by ranchers, and they were asking too much for the right-of-way. So Butte Flume and Lumber didn't want to pay it, and so they ended up falling a little short of Chico at the time. Now, this is in 1877. This is a portion of 1877 official map of Tama County, and you're going to see a lot of maps today, and I don't ever show you a whole map. I just zoom in on the point of interest, so it's always going to be just a portion of it. And this map shows the 3 mills at the head of the flume at that time. We have the Cascade and the Belmont mills right here that I'm circling with my laser pointer here. And they were owned by Butte Flume and Lumber Company. And then we had the Arcade Mill down here. And that was owned by the McCormick brothers. And that was located actually at the confluence of Big Chico Creek and Cascade Creek, but they don't show that very well on this map. Anyway, so these 3 mills and that length of flume you see there in Tehama County were originally in Butte County. But in 1874, they resurveyed the boundary lines, and these 3 mills and 9 miles of flume were put in Tehama County instead. And I understand speculation had it that it had something to do with tax revenues. They suspected these mills were going to make some money in the future, so they decided, hey, we better check things out first. And then after it left Tehama County, it came down into Butte County. And this is a portion of the 1877 Butte County map, official map of Butte County 1877. And it snaked its way down through Big Chico Creek Canyon, and at the very bottom, I'll put on my little magnifying glass here, you can see H.D. Weld. That would soon become the town of Forest Ranch up there in Highway 32. He owned it at that time, and then they put a post office in there at 1878, and that's when it became Forest Ranch. Then it continued on down through Big Chico Creek Canyon. Now, in 1875, the V-FLUME and Lumber Company, was bought out by the Sierra Flume and Lumber Company, who swallowed up a bunch of other mills, timberland and lumber companies, including the Arcade Mill, and they became a giant in the lumber industry while they were in existence. In 1876, John Bidwell bought that land and gave the right-of-way to Sierra Flume and Lumber Company to get the flume the rest of the way into Chico. It was about 3 to 3.5 miles. And the flume was now 37 miles long. And so here we have, at the bottom of this map, here's the old dump here while I'm circling it with this hand here. That's what they called Oakville eventually. And then John Bidwell bought this land right here to bring it all the way into Chico at a new dump site at 8th and Pine Streets. And here we have the new dump site. This is at 8th and Pine. There was a planing mill there, and fruit box and tray stock factory, and at one time there was a sash factory there too. Now, if you'll notice, the flume went straight down 8th Street and then made this sharp right-hand turn. We'll talk about that in the next slide. Here we have an 1886 Sanborn fire insurance map, and it shows a lumber yard between 8th Street and Humboldt Avenue. I know it says Humboldt Road there, but I think it's supposed to say Humboldt Avenue actually. And at the very top of the map, you can see this blue streak. That's the flume. It's flume's going down 8th Street, and then it makes a sharp right turn there at Pine Street. And where did the flume go from there? Where did they didn't need that water anymore, so they called it discharge water. Well, it eventually connected with John Bidwell's flume that it was already there, that had water in it to power the water wheel at his flour mill. So this just gave him a little extra charge to do that. And then in the mid-1880s, I think it was 1885, John Bidwell went to steam, and they no longer needed that. So then the discharge water went to the north side of Big Chico Creek to irrigate land over there. One thing that's wrong about this particular map here, other than the Humboldt thing, is that this is 1886, right? And it says Sierra Flume and Lumber Company owns this yard. Well, that can't be, because the Sierra Flume and Lumber Company went bankrupt in 1878. And they reorganized as the Sierra Lumber Company. And the Sierra Lumber Company was initially under control of some of the same guys that drove the Sierra Flume and Lumber Company into the ground. But then a better economic climate and more efficient managerial practices made Sierra Lumber a very successful company for many years to come afterwards, until they were bought out by Diamond Match Company in 1907. Well, as the name implies, the V-FLUME was shaped like a V. It normally had two sides come together at a 90-degree angle. It varied though amongst lumber companies. Some might be a little more 90 and some might be a little bit less. And we have a walkway next to it. Just about all V-FLUMEs, at least all the ones I've seen, have a walkway so you can access the flume when necessary. Here we have a cross section of a flume sitting on top of some trestle work. You can see it's resting on some boulders. Also, I understand that in really soft soil, they might rest it on big logs. But I want to direct your attention to the top here. You'll see here in the vertex of the flume that I've got these red colored hash marks to represent a triangular shaped board that was set into the flume by some of the lumber companies. And not only by adding this piece, did it strengthen the flume a little bit, but it also took up space so that you needed less water to operate the flume. The problem was it was expensive to do, and so a lot of flume companies didn't do that. But the big Chico Creek V-FLUME did have something like this, or very similar to it. Okay, here we have the big Chico Creek V-FLUME near where the old dump was located. You can see this guy sitting on there on the edge of the flume and his feet resting on the walkway. I'd like to direct you to your attention here to this corner here. I don't know if you can make it out, but there's some cables that are supporting the flume there, so sometimes the flume needs a little extra help. Now, V-FLUMEs, their dimensions changed. I mean, they varied among the different logging companies that might built them. The one at Chico, in Chico Creek, was believed to be about 16 inches across at the bottom, and it had 32-inch sloping sides, and it was about 48 inches across at water level. Now, the V-FLUMEs were an improvement over their square box predecessors because not only did they require less lumber to build, but they used less water to operate. And furthermore, they were less likely to have a lumber jam. For one thing, they were narrow, pile up behind them. And furthermore, if a lumber jam did start to occur, the pressure from the backwater would lift the lumber in front up and into the widening section of the flume. So, in theory, the V-FLUMEs were self-clearing, right? But not always, right? And that's why they had flume tender stations scattered along the length of the flume at strategic points where there might be lumber jams. Usually, a flume tender would live in here with his family if he had one. And flume tender's two main jobs were to, one thing, make repairs to the flume anywhere close to his station. And also, if there's lumber jam, go out there and clear it as fast as you can. Because the lumber jams could be very devastating. Lumber jams on high trestle work just put too much weight on the trestle, and the trestle could collapse underneath it. So it was very important to avoid lumber jams whenever possible. This particular photo was taken in the lower part of the big Chico Creek Ecological Reserve up there on Highway 32 below Forest Ranch. And you can see the lumber floating through the flume right next to it. This photo was taken in Upper Bidwell Park. Again, it's, you see it looks like a couple of flume tenders there. And you have, one of them must have had a family there. This is what's left of a flume tender station that you can still see today. Dave's been there. It was called the Palace. And it was in the upper part of what's today's Big Chico Creek Ecological Reserve. Now, actually, there were two palaces. The first one burned down in 1898. And Richard Price was, I think it was Richard Price, was a flume tender there at the time. And it burned down, and his family was able to escape with nothing but a sewing machine. Well, that's pretty important. At least they saved that sewing machine. In those days, sewing machines were important. And then they rebuilt another flume station nearby and called it the Palace too. So I don't know whether this was the first one or the second one, but I didn't see any soot on that foundation at all. If you remember correctly, Dave, there are a few burned pieces of wood on the ground, but I don't know if we could have attributed those to a major fire, and it could have been something else that caused it. So I don't know whether it was the first one or the second one, but this was what some evidence is left of one of the flume tender stations. Now this is not the Big Chico Creek flume. These two flume tenders are on the Empire flume. The Empire Flume is north of the Big Chico Creek Flume. It was also owned by Sierra Lumber. Sierra Lumber had two divisions in those days. It had the Chico division, which had the Big Chico Creek Flume, and they had the Red Bluff division that had the Empire Flume. And these guys are on the Empire Flume and Flume Tender Station. If you'll notice, this one guy's handling a tool. This tool right there that he used to maneuver the lumber around. And the tool was generally called a picaroon, and they still use picaroons today. That's a very unusual style of picaroon, where you have two hooks that come to a point at the top of this rod here. This is really the only time I've ever seen this style of picaroon. But since they used it on their flume up there, an Empire Flume, which was owned by Sierra Lumber, it's possible that the people on Big Chico Creek Flume used it also. I don't know. But I'd like to share with you a more typical looking picaroon. This is a picaroon that my wife bought for me in an antique shop up in Portland, Oregon. This is what a lot of picaroons look like. You know, they're about the length of an axe handle. Generally they have one point that's hooked, it's got a sharp point, and you can just see how it'll dig into a piece of lumber. They also move logs around sometimes. And they had this style around this area too. I've seen them around here too. I don't know about, I've never seen an actual picaroon on the Big Chico Creek Flume though, that's the problem. I see a guy carrying it, but in the next slide, oops. Good thing they're sturdy, huh? They've probably seen worse than that before. Like in this image right here, coming up, you'll see that guy there in the center carrying the tool, see it? That's probably a picaroon, but I can't identify what kind of picaroon it is. Anyway, now this is taken in Iron Canyon. As you can see, it's two parallel flumes. And that indicates there's a switch nearby and to reroute the water. And so I believe there was a station that was called China Switch, was in the vicinity of where this photo was taken. And why did they have two flumes there? Well, it was likely a place that they had a lot of lumber jams. And so they probably rerouted the water so they could get things moving and clear out the jam that way. Now, V-FLUMEs transported more than just lumber. You'd see shakes and cordwood go down it. A common misconception about the Big Chico Creek Flume was that people shipped logs down it. That couldn't have been, because it couldn't have withstood the weight of a log. It would have collapsed. Now I understand some V-FLUMEs did transport logs, but not ours. Ours wasn't that heavy duty. Anyway, so it had shakes and cordwood, not logs. Sometimes people in the mountains would ship fish catches, venison. I read one story about some bear hide being floated down the flume to friends down the valley. And also, but maybe what this flume was most well known, V-FLUMEs were most well known for, other than transporting lumber, was people would ride down the flume on rafts or flume boats. And especially in emergencies, these things came really handy. If a person up in the mountains got injured and needed to get down the valley really quickly to the best medical facilities available, that was the best way to do it, was to take the V-FLUME down there. But speaking of fish catches, people ask me, were there fish in the flume? Did people go fishing in the flume? Well, I have read several accounts of people actually fishing in the flume. I came across one newspaper account, and you're going to hear me talking about newspapers because that's my primary research source. I like to go through old newspapers. I've read one newspaper account that was talking about how easy it was for the guys at the dump. I mean, the fish would just float by. You see, it's not all that deep. All they had to do was hit them over the head with a picaroon or a club or whatever kind of instrument they might have handy, and dinner plans were set for the evening. It almost didn't seem quite fair. So yes, there were fish in the flume. Now, this photo is taken just down below Iron Canyon in Upper Park. And this is the Randy Taylor photo here. What I want to say here is the flume snaked down Big Chico Creek Canyon, sometimes very high on trestle work. And I understand that sometimes it was as high as 100 feet in the air. Other times, it was right next to the ground. Like at this unknown location, I don't know where it was, but it's a V-FLUME. This is a photo of the yard, the new arcade mill, which in the late early 1880s, Sierra Lumber decided to start phasing out the mills on Cascade Creek. And so in 1881, they shut down the Belmont Mill and they shut down the Arcade Mill and moved the men and machinery to a new mill that was being built in Chico Meadows called the New Arcade Mill. And then in 1882, the Cascade Mill and the New Arcade Mill both ran at the same time. They had both a full season of logging under their belt. But then after that, the Cascade Mill shut down. And so between 1883 and 1894, this was the only mill that was operating in the mountains on the Big Chico Creek flume. And then in 1895, they opened up a new mill further on down. And they call it the West Branch Mill, or otherwise known as the Providence Mill. It started operating in 1895, like I said, and it continued on until 1906, which was the last year it was operating. It was going to close down anyway, and in early 1907, Diamond Match bought them out, so it didn't make any difference. Now you'll notice that I want to say one thing about this mill. You know, like I said, I do a lot of research in the newspapers, and I came across one article that said that it was around early 1900, and it said Sierra Lumber was said to put out more money out to labor than any other industry in Butte County at that time. And it was primarily because of that mill. That was a huge mill. It employed a lot of people. The flume employed a lot of people. Anyway, so you can see the yard in it, the lumber yard, and you can see the flumes going down through the lumber. And of course, they all converge together further down. Now, this is a portion of a map that was drawn by a man called W.H. Hutchinson. Old Hutch was a professor here at Chico State for many years, and he's passed on right now. But in my opinion, I think he was the ultimate authority on logging in the hills and mountains east of Chico and Red Bluff. He was very knowledgeable about it, and I referenced him a lot. Now this is a portion of the map he drew. He surveyed it. I zoomed in on the Chico Creek flume there in the center of the photo. Ignore that flume on the right hand side. That's the Flea Valley flume, which I'll talk about later, but I want to talk about the Chico Creek flume. Now this particular map was not a snapshot in time. It was a summary of the flumes and related features from the years 1870 to the year 1907. So let's zoom in on it here and look at some of the stuff it had on it. Here, where my hand is pointing there, is you see the Cascade Mill, the Belmont Mill, and the Arcade Mill, all along Cascade Creek. And then, of course, they were phased out, and we have the new Arcade Mill over here at Chico Meadows, not far away. So then they, when this one was operating by itself, they closed down that part of the flume down Cascade Creek, and the flume was still 37 miles. It didn't change the length of the flume at all. Then, after the new Arcade Mill shut down in 1894, in 1895, they opened up the Providence Mill, or the West Branch Mill, and that operated till 1906. When they opened up the Providence Mill, or West Branch Mill, they closed down. They abandoned the rest of the flume, which was probably a good idea because by that point, that part of the flume was getting pretty rotten. And It was the scariest part of the flume. In my first book about the West Branch Mill, I have a couple personal accounts of people taking flume boat rides down the flume, and that section was pretty harrowing. Anyway, so another point of interest on this map is Hooper's bolt mill. As hard as I tried, I couldn't find anything about Hooper's bolt mill in the newspapers or in Hutch's notes, and I scoured through his notes. But apparently there's a bolt mill up there by Lomo. Bolt is a block of wood you would split into shakes with a furrow. And one last thing I want to point out here is Cusick's Smoky Creek Mill. Now Barney Cusick was head of the logging operations up in that area for most of the 1880s and part of the 1890s. And he supervised the building of the new Arcade Mill and the building of the West Branch Mill. But he also had a lot of log contracts with Sierra Lumber. He worked for Sierra Lumber and he had contracts with them. And one contract he had is he built his own mill up there on Big Smoky Creek. And he supplied lumber to Sierra Lumber Company. And he put it in the flume from that Smoky Creek mill. But as you can see in that image, it's not next to the flume. It's kind of far away, isn't it? It's about 2 or 3 miles away. And to make matters worse, there was a 400-foot high ridge in between. So how did he get the lumber to the flume? Well, on top of the ridge there was this large hoist house. And there was a big wooden drum, and it had 2.5-mile cable wrapped around it. And it'd pull up cars of lumber from the Smoky Creek Mill up to the top of the ridge and then lower them down to where the flume was so it could be dumped into the flume. And here is that hoist house. Here's a photo of it. And you can see 2 cars of lumber here. That's what they normally pulled up with the hoist. Each car had about 2,500 feet of lumber on it. It wasn't too long after they built the flume that the V-FLUME and Lumber Company realized, you know, this place was kind of dangerous, you know. And so they put out this notice on September 18th, 1874, and it said, "To all whom it may concern, notice is hereby given that the V-FLUME and Lumber Company absolutely forbid all persons from riding down their flume. Offenders will be prosecuted to the full extent of the law." Well, then Sierra Flume and Lumber took over after that, and they had their set of rules. And I'd like to direct you to item number 2, where it says, "Superintendents will prevent all persons from riding down the flumes. Employees of the company will not be permitted to ride in any of the flumes except to make repairs or in the case of emergency where the business of the company requires someone to go quickly to the valley." So apparently even company employees were discouraged from riding the flume. Now, unless it was absolutely necessary. Now, the public wasn't even allowed to walk the flume. But some rules are made to be broken, and apparently this was one of them. You know, the convenience that it provided, you can see how it could be a shortcut. And the thrill of excitement it presented was just too much to pass up. Like for this young couple that's sitting on the flume in Iron Canyon here, there's probably about 60 or 70 feet up in the air. Now, I'd like to tell you about what Paul Roberts said. Paul Roberts was a columnist for the Chico Record in 1947. And in one of his columns, he reminisced about growing up next to the flume when he was a kid. And this is what he had to say about it. He said, "There was something about the flume that thrilled you. The danger, the varying height, the speed of the water, the lumber floating down in an endless stream. Men, women, and kids liked to climb the flume, walk the 12-inch plank along one side, or ride a raft of lumber." And later in the article, Paul goes on to say, as soon as I get this mouse going, he goes on to say, "The picnickers and thrill seekers walked this plank too, especially on Sundays and holidays, despite warning signs and the caretakers who tried to shoo us off. There were no speeding autos in those days, but we humans were bitten by the thrill bug just the same, and naturally had to do something about it. So the flume was our thriller." So I could relate. Just watching the water swiftly moving by was mesmerizing. It made people do some crazy things, like this guy sitting on top of this rock right next to the flume. He's way up there. Or this guy is standing on a cliff looking down at the flume. Well, this is a photo that probably a lot of you have seen already. It seems to be everywhere. It's a photo of Dr. Enlow and his son Newt Jr. sitting on his lap. He's on a flume boat. Dr. Enlow came from Missouri in 1901 and arrived in Chico and was looking for a job. And some guy in Chico said, well, there's a mill up there in the mountains, and they're looking for a physician to live up there with the loggers, because those loggers are always getting hurt and they need immediate attention. So Dr. Enlow went up there and he applied, and he got the job as a resident physician at the West Branch Mill, the Providence Mill we were just talking about. And this is how he got his start in California medicine. This is his first opportunity to practice it in California, living with the loggers up there. And then we know what happened after that. You know the rest of the story. Now the two people with him, it's debatable who they are. Some people believe that the woman in the middle is one of his two sisters. He had two sisters here with him, Emma and her husband Dan Knorr, who was a worker at the mill. I don't know when they were married, but they were married at some point. I personally believe it may be Martha, his other sister, and the man would likely be her husband, Frank Thatcher, who was the superintendent of the West Branch Mill from 1900 to 1907 when Diamond took it over. And the reason I say that is that this looks like Frank Thatcher to me. And Dr. Enlow relative that said it didn't look like what she remembered Dan Knorr looking like. So I don't know for sure who it is, but that's my guess. Either way, we know it's Dr. Enlow and we know it's Newt Jr. in the back there. Here, Sierra Lumber gave a man called J.F. Nash permission to ride down the flume in his raft. Now, I believe this photo was taken in 1901. They're leaving from the West Branch Mill, by the way. I've stood in this very spot. I've matched up that hill. I know where we're at. J.F. Nash, at the time, these pictures came from the Bancroft Library down in Berkeley. And they came in a folder, and the folder said that he was a member of a group that included Frederick Dakin, and they were going around taking photos of mining operations and timber operations at the time. Well, the reason I say I think it's 1901, because in 1901, Frederick Dakin was known to have taken an option out on the Chico division of the V-FLUME company, and he tried to sell it to Diamond Match Company. Diamond Match didn't bite at the time. But Dakin did manage to sell them 40,000 other acres called the Sierra Estate. And then later, Diamond got a little bit more acreage. And that started the Diamond Match era in California. J.F. Nash, by the way, happened to be the first superintendent of the woods and sawmill operations at Sterling City when Diamond Match opened that area up. And here he is, arriving at a flume tender station down there in Upper Bidwell Park. This is just, I was going to say, this is not too far from Bear Hole in Upper Park. Okay, this is not the Big Chico Creek flume either. This is a drawing of two frightened looking men going down a V-FLUME on the eastern slope of the Sierra in the 1870s. What I wanted to point out for one thing was that you could see now all the photos of vehicles that people rode on in Big Chico Creek flume, they're sitting on top of it, so we can call them rafts. But they also had boats you could sit inside of. Now I haven't seen any of that in Big Chico Creek flume, but I assume there might have been some of those too. So that was another way of riding the flume, was something like that. But this, I want to say that this is kind of a scary looking ride, and the Big Chico Creek flume also had some very scary spots. Like I said, that part that they abandoned after West Branch Mill opened up was really, really bad in some spots, really scary. But this is a photo of Iron Canyon, by the way, in Upper Park. But you know, accidents could happen on the flume anywhere. It didn't have to be in a particularly dangerous spot. And through my research, I came across some interesting stories, and I'd like to share a few of them, some short stories with you about some accidents that occurred on the Big Chico Creek flume. And I'd like to start with a story about Shorty Burke, who, as told by Mike McCluskey to the Butte Record. And he said that Shorty was riding down the flume one day, late in the winter, just relaxing, I guess, laying back, reading his newspaper, smoking his pipe, you know, everything was cool, everything was nice. And all of a sudden he gets to this place called Cape Horn, which was a notoriously bad spot of the flume. It was very steep and swift. And his flume separates, dumping poor Shorty into the cold snowbelt water. Well, Shorty's able to climb out of the flume eventually, and he gets on a walkway, but he is dripping, soaking wet. And he slips off the walkway and goes headlong into a snowbank below. And lucky for Shorty, a flume walker was nearby and was able to extract him from his most difficult, and I imagine, embarrassing situation. Another story involved John Mulder. Now, John Mulder was a laborer on the flume, and he was going down the flume one day on a raft that was heavily loaded with equipment. And it was on a part of the flume that was kind of getting old. And the flume collapsed underneath him, dropping John 90 feet to the ground. And you would have thought Mulder would have died. But you know, I know he was banged up, bruised up, pretty bad. But I couldn't find anything in the newspapers. I couldn't find anything in the death records for Butte County about it. Tama County didn't have death records for those years. So I'm going to assume that John Mulder survived this accident. And you know, it's possible, you know, the trestle work maybe broke his fall a little bit, I don't know. Maybe he was just downright lucky. But speaking about luck, we'll talk about Captain O'Neill. Here's another story. Captain O'Neill was an experienced flume rider, and he went down the flume quite a few times with no mishaps, but apparently his luck was about to run out one day. He's going down the flume and he hears this crash and he looks in front of him and he sees this tree branch across the flume. And he goes, uh-oh. So he bails. He gets off of his boat, gets on the walkway, and the boards break underneath him, send him 20 feet to the ground.
200 feet?
No, 20 feet. Did I say 200?
Yeah.
Oh, I said 20. Correct me if I say something really out of hand sometimes. Sometimes I get dates wrong. But anyway, it's 20 feet. He fell 20 feet on the soft soil, and so he was okay. He was kind of bruised up, but so he was lucky in that respect. At least he came down in a good spot. Now, and the last short story I'd like to share with you involves Frank Thatcher. We talked about Frank Thatcher. He was Dr. Enlow's brother-in-law. This was before he was superintendent of the West Branch Mill. Him and William Fitzpatrick were going down the flume one day, and they were all of a sudden shocked to suddenly see a break in the flume right ahead of them on a 60-foot trestle. And by that point, it was too late to do anything about it. They just had to hope for the best. Well, the water was going swift enough to shot them over the break, and they landed on the other side, and the boat came to a screeching halt, and the news said they climbed down the supports to safety. So yeah, and you know, my research, I came across quite a few crazy stories about things that happened on the flume. Now, you didn't have to be riding a boat to be injured on the flume either, or have an accident. A lot of people, in fact, most of the injuries on the flume were from the public or even employees walking along the flume and falling off. A board breaking underneath them or something like that. In my research, and I looked through it pretty thoroughly from the beginning to the end of the flume years, I only came across 2 known deaths because of the flume, on the flume. The first one was a worker called Doc Apperson. He just fell off the flume. He was working on it for some reason. He fell off about 20 feet, hit his head on some rocks below, and died from his injuries. The other one was a young man called Erastus McCarger. Erastus McCarger and 2 friends went up Chico Creek Canyon one day to go hunting and decided to take the flume back. back home. I guess he lived down at the old dump. Now there's two versions of the story. One newspaper said they actually managed to build a raft. And another one said, well, they just jumped on a lumber jam with a bunch of wood that was together and just rode that lumber down. I don't know which one it was. I'm more inclined to believe it was probably a lumber jam. They were shooed off at one time by the caretaker, but they got back on later. But so they're floating down the flume on their way back home, and they see another lumber jam up ahead, and Erastus McCarter panics and gets off of whatever he was riding onto the walkway and slips off and falls 60 feet, and he didn't make it. So in over 30 years of operation though, I only came across 2 deaths on the Big Chico Creek flume, and that's a pretty good safety record in my opinion. Chico had an interesting visitor one day. It was called the hydraulic locomotive. Now, we know that flume boats can get you down the valley pretty quick from the mountains, and a lot more comfortably, not only quickly, but more comfortably than on a bumpy old wagon road. Wouldn't it have been nice to have a vehicle to get you back up the flume so you wouldn't have to ride that bumpy old wagon road that way either? So this guy called Columbus Layman, 2 men, Columbus Layman and John Heckert, came up with this invention. It was patented November 7th, 1876, and it worked on the assumption that you could power this vehicle up the flume from the energy you gain from the downhill current of water. So you can see the diagram here. It's pretty easy to understand. In the middle of it, you have a platform for carrying cargo. On either end, you have these paddle wheels. And at each end of the paddle wheel, you had a flange wheel that would ride on the rail of the flume. And so the way it works is if you set it on top of the flume, and then the downhill flow of the water would turn these paddle wheels, and the shaft on the paddle wheels would turn the flange wheels, which would crawl up the edge of the flume. And by the way, the paddle wheels could be disengaged going back down. You might not want it in gear. So in early 1876, that was before it was patented, a correspondent wrote to the Chico Enterprise and said that there was a working model of this vehicle they were trying out on a temporary flume they'd set up in Rancho Chico, somewhere near the nursery, or just beyond it. And the flume was about 30 feet long, and they set it on a hillside that was sloped about 10 inches to the rod. I understand the rod's about 16.5 feet. And they tried it with a load of bricks, and according to this correspondent, who was unidentified by the way, he said they went about 4 or 5 miles an hour. That's not too bad. And then they put John Heckert's 180-pound body on it, and it did just fine there too. So it was a success. And then later that year, of course, they patented it. And then you didn't hear too much about this vehicle for a while until 1879, when it was reported that it was on exhibition on the Hewitt flume in Oroville. Again, it was tried out and was a success. But then after that, it kind of dropped off the radar. You didn't hear much more about this vehicle anymore. Some people said it only worked on shallow slopes, not steep slopes. You know, personally, I'm not a scientist, but I honestly believe that the laws of physics just weren't on its side. It's just but you know, it was an interesting idea nonetheless, and it would have been great if it did work. But like I said, I'm not a scientist. I don't know. Okay, one thing I like to do when I do my research is look at old historical photos and see if I can find out what that same place looks like today. So we're going to start with this photo right here. This was called the arch structure, John Noble photo. This is a very interesting structure. This is the only place I've ever seen one like that. It had to span a wide part of this rocky canyon. That's why I needed that good arch structure. They're pretty strong. And you can see that it's the exact same place. I had to, by the way, I mountain biked down from Highway 32 about 500 or 600 feet in elevation. Then I had to walk a trail and go down the steep ravine and walk across the creek to capture this angle. But I think I nailed it. Because you can see this rock's the same as that rock, and that rock's the same as that rock, and it's the same place. It doesn't look any different, other than the fact there's no flume on it today. Here's another trestle. This is the one's a little easier to get to. This is in Upper Bidwell Park. If you go up Highway 32 and you know where the 10-mile trail is across the street, they have that, what they call Green Gate, and people like to hike down there and mountain bike down there, and it'll take you down to Big Chico Creek. So you take that trail all the way down there and go about a quarter-mile upstream, and you'll find this place. And you can see that rock matches that rock, and the shading is different. It's a different time of year, but it's the exact same place, I assure you. Here's Iron Canyon, then and now. That's looking at the east side from the west. And here's old J.F. Nash again. Every once in a while I'm going to show a picture again. This is one of them. This is him going through Upper Park, not too far from Bear Hole. You can see this promontory back here. It's been referred to, I understand the name of it is called Lost Compass Point by some locals. And you can see it in both photos. Now, actually where Nash is going through on this flume tender station, it's in a bunch of trees, and you couldn't see the background if I took it from there. So actually my wife took this photo of me down there, a little bit below the point where Nash is, but you know, I'm pretty darn close to it. And here's this photo I'm wondering if Dave was talking about earlier. Is this the one you're talking about, Dave, where you can see the bluffs in the background?
Yeah.
This is a great one. This is in the background of bluffs are Peregrine Point. There's a Frisbee golf course up there, just above there. It's off of Highway 32. But down here, the bottom is Bear Hole. So it's above Bear Hole. Now, let's go up here and turn on the magnifying glass. Can you make out the flume back there? There's the flume back there.
Oh, yeah.
And another thing I want to point out is this ranch down here. You can see this rock wall that goes around the ranch. See that? Can you make it out? Mm-hmm. Well, that rock wall is still there today. A little more dilapidated, but it's still there today. So, it looks like there's a few more trees today, but other than that, it's pretty much the same, like this close to Bear Hole. And here we go back to the guy sitting on the rock. I call it the hole in the rock. And here we have him in old days, and what it looks like today, it hasn't changed. That rock's still exactly the same. You can't see Lost Compass Point. That's Lost Compass Point again in the contemporary photo because it's got trees blocking the way. And here we have our own Dave Noble sitting on top of that rock from a different angle. And you can see it's pretty steep, and he's up there a ways. And I don't know how he managed to do it, but he scaled this rock, got on top, and sat up there. I'll tell you, I've been there several times, and I wouldn't go there on top where Dave is without a ladder. And there,
The other side of the rock.
yeah. There's that point right there where my arrow was pointing. That's where that guy was sitting.
We can't see the arrow.
Can't see it.
Oh, you can't see the arrow? Oh, did you see the hand before when I was talking about it?
No.
Oh, well, on my screen you can. That's too bad. You can't see the hand here either, huh? Well, I'm glad you guys told me that. Now I know. But I can use a laser pointer here when I'm not on this. Okay. There's Dave, of course. And there's the little point that the guy was sitting on top of.
Just before he got hemorrhoids.
Yeah. You could tell, yeah, that would hurt. Okay, and here's this guy looking down on from the cliff again. We saw this photo earlier. This guy is standing, and again, it doesn't quite look the same, but I assure you it's the same angle and everything. It's just a different type of year, time of year, and maybe a different time of day, it looks like. He is standing directly across from where the Upper Bidwell Park Golf Course clubhouse is located today. So he's looking right at it from where he's at. If it was there, it wasn't there in those days ago. What's that?
Use your pointer to show where the guy is.
Oh, you don't see the guy?
No.
There he is right there. See him? Boy, it's kind of late for me to find out that that other stuff doesn't work. Well, at least I'll keep that in mind. Okay, so we're getting close to the end of the show. I said I'd talk a little bit about two other V-FLUMEs that were in Butte County. And we're going to use the 1877 map, official map of Butte County again, although this is the Public Works version, it's a little more clear. In the first V-FLUME I want to talk about originated in Flea Valley at a mill appropriately called the Flea Valley Mill. Can you see that's kind of in the center of my, I wish I could point to it, but I can't use the zoom and the pointer at the same time. This Flea Valley Mill was also referred to as a Defiance Mill. Today it's known as, the site is known as Rag Dump. It's about 5 miles east of Paradise Lake. So in 1875, the Sugar Pine Flume and Lumber Company, or Sugar Pine Lumber Flume and Mining Company, started construction on the flume and completed it by 1876. And in 1876, they built another lumber mill up there in section 31, if you can see it up there on the upper right-hand corner of the slide. And that was a Rock Creek Lumber Flume and Mining Company that built a mill there called the Rock Creek Mill. And it wanted to build a flume to tie into the other flume there at Flea Valley Sawmill. So after they built the mill in 1876, and they finished the flume construction in 1877. But unlike the Flea Valley Mill, they got their water from a reservoir behind the mill site. And I imagine they did that by damming up Fall Creek. They got their water from a source 2 miles above the mill. And so when the flume went by the Rock Creek Mill, it was 250 feet up on the mountainside. Uh-oh, another problem. So how'd they get it up there? Well, they had a 1,000-foot tramway and a steam engine on top, and it pulled lumber cars up to the flume. So that's how they did that. So this flume was part of a larger waterway that went all the way to a dump near Pence's Ranch. And that dump had a planing mill and a new set of sash and door factory at one time too. The lower part was a ditch, and I'll get to that in the next slide. This upper part, which was the V-FLUME, I measured to be about 15 miles from where the V-FLUME turned into a ditch to where the water source was for the Rock Creek flume. No, I want to say one more thing. This was the only flume that originated in Butte County and ended in Butte County. The other two flumes originated in another county and ended in Butte County. So here we have the lower part of the flume, which actually wasn't a flume, it was a ditch. It turned into a ditch where across, you can't see it here, right where you see where it says T22NR, Township 22, Range 4E. Just to the left of that, you'll see where it says dam. And that's where the flume turned into the ditch. It crossed the west branch of the Feather River about a half a mile east of where the Feather River Hospital used to be before it burned, maybe a little south of that. Crossed on wire cable, and then it turned into a ditch. And that ditch was about 7 miles long. And so the total length of this flume was about 22 miles. Now, in 1883, the news reports suggested that they no longer transferred lumber down the flume anymore, transported lumber down the flume. And in 1883, and in 1886, it was reported that the flume was being torn down completely. So this was not a very long-lived flume. It only lasted about 8 years. But the ditch was still used for transferring water for many years afterwards. But the V-FLUME part didn't last that long. Now, as far as I know, there are no photos of the Flea Valley flume anywhere. And so I'm going to use this photo of the big Chico Creek flume again to illustrate how dangerous it was for workers on the flume. This photo was taken in Iron Canyon, and I'm assuming these are workers on the flume. I don't know. The caption does not say what they were. But it looks like 3 workers that are trying to either free a jam or maybe keep the lumber going so a jam doesn't happen. These guys are 60 or 70 feet up in the air probably, and look at this walkway. Are those boards even nailed down? I mean, this is dangerous. Well, as I told you earlier, lumber jams on high trestles could be bad, real bad, because it caused the trestle to collapse underneath if too much weight piled up. Well, that's precisely what happened on the Flea Valley flume one day in summer of 1877. There's a lumber jam below the Flea Valley Mill about 2 miles on a trestle that was about 70 feet high. And so 5 men were called out to clear the jam. Well, 4 men were on the trestle when it collapsed underneath them, and it killed 2 of them. And the other 2 were pretty badly injured too. And then 2 months later, a guy was walking along that flume. I don't know whether he was a company employee or whether he was a member of the public. The newspapers didn't specify, but he fell off and died. And so in about 8 years, or maybe even less, of operation, this flume had 3 deaths on it. So not a very good safety record. And not only that, it had financial problems in the very beginning, and it changed hands a lot. So I would not consider this one a very successful flume. Okay, and here's the last flume I'm going to talk about. It's called Leach's flume, and we're going to refer to the 1887 official map of Yuba County. And Andrew Leach came from Vermont. He came from a pretty well-to-do family who made their money in lumbering, and so he thought he'd come out here out west, and make a fortune in lumbering here in California. So he bought a bunch of mills and timberland up in Yuba County in the 1870s. And after a while, he realized that teaming lumber down from the hills and the mountains above down the valley was getting awfully expensive. So he decided to build a V-FLUME. And this map shows the first part of that V-FLUME. Boy, I wish my pointer was working here. Oh, wait a second. I'm not blowing it up so I can show it to you. Oh, I did blow it up, yeah. Okay. Well, anyway, it originated at the Challenge Mills in 1880. It originated at Challenge Mills and came down to the foothills, crossed the border into Butte County, and then about 10 miles of it crossed into Butte County to where there was a dump called Moore Station. And Moore Station was in or near the town of Honcut. And Moore Station was along the California Northern Railroad, and there was a planing mill and a box factory nearby there. So this part of the flume was completed in 1883. But the flume didn't stop there. Over the next decade, it twisted and climbed its way far into northeastern Yuba County. And I'll briefly go over what it did. So here's the Challenge Mills. I'm going to switch over to my pen here. Here's the Challenge Mills down here. In 1883, that section of flume was completed. Then around 1885, the section between Woodville and Challenge was completed. And then around 1889, the section between Empire and Woodville was completed. And actually it was completed beyond Empire, because the Empire Mill was another one of those mills, was down in a canyon, and the flume was above it, so they needed a tramway to get the lumber up to the flume. And then it gets kind of sketchy date-wise after that, but I do know that the Al Gulch Mill, I want you to pay particular attention to that, was along the length of the flume. And the Deadwood Mill, somewhere up here, was along the length of the flume. And then the flume finally ended up at Slate Creek, where it got its initial charge of water. Of course, it got fed by feeder streams on the way down, too. There are no official maps that show the rest of this flume. I don't know why. It's well documented this flume existed in all these mills, but there are no maps that I know of that show it. So, but you can kind of get an idea by following my mills how it went. And it's also one other mill down here, I don't know where it was, called the Beanville Mill, and it had a railroad that it put lumber cars on, and that railroad went to Challenge Mills, and they dumped it in the flume there too. So when the flume was completed, it was probably about 50 miles long. I shouldn't say flume because this upper part was really a bunch of trestles, tunnels, and ditches up there too. It was a very rugged country. So we're going to call it a waterway too. The waterway, the entire waterway was probably about 50 miles long, and 10 miles of it was in Butte County. There were no mount mills on that section, only the dump. Now in the late 80s, Andrew Leach started coming into financial difficulties when his couple of his mills caught on fire. And then in 1892, the flume blew down by Moore Station, and the financially strapped company asked the citizens of Honcut to chip in and help pay to put the flume back up because they couldn't afford to do it on their own. So the citizens of Honcut coughed up some money and they put the flume back up, but they didn't anchor it very well, and the wind blew it down again. And so Andrew Leach is really suffering by then. And then you have the 1893 panic, financial panic and economic depression. By 1894, Andrew Leach was broke, and by 1895, he sold the whole kit and caboodle to a Chicago outfit. I don't know what happened after that. So I'm going to end this presentation with this photo right here. This is the Al Gulch mill. Remember, I mentioned this in the last slide where Al Gulch was high up there on the flume, on the waterway. This trestle behind this mill is 166 feet tall, they say. Now, it is assumed they use a tramway with a steam engine on top to get the lumber from the mill up to the flume, but there's no documentation to verify it. Unlike at the Empire Mill and the Rock Creek Mills we talked about earlier. And that is the end of my program. I hope you enjoyed it. Go ahead.
Where did the water dump out of the flume back into Chico, Creek and Chico? How did it get back into there?
To get in, well, the flume, first it supported Bidwell's flume there that powered his water wheel on his flour mill, and then after that they just irrigated land north of the creek. It did never go directly back into the creek again.
So the water didn't go into the river eventually?
Well, it went into the land around the river, so I imagine it percolated through, yeah. Yeah.
I had seen somewhere that Thomas Edison and then U.S. President Hendricks had made some investments in some of these flumes. Mm-hmm. Did you bump into that?
No, I've never come across anything like that, no. Okay. Sorry. Oh, go ahead.
Questions. Did the flume run 24 hours a day?
Yeah, it could. Yeah, but like Paul Roberts said, usually on Sundays, when everybody was, taking the day off, it didn't run then generally.
Because the one picture that showed the young man and the young woman,
yes,
it was empty.
That's right, and that's probably on a Sunday.
Okay.
Yeah. Or maybe they were doing maintenance work, I don't know.
Right.
We don't know what the story behind that is.
Yeah,
but a lot of the times the water will just run and there would be no lumber because people were taking the day off.
Gotcha. Okay,
So,
thank you.
Go ahead.
How did they build that? I mean, if you started on the first layer, wouldn't it get kind of scary?
Yeah, and I tell you, I don't have that photo, but there's a couple of excellent photos. If you go to Chico State University and go on their digital website, their digital photo website, they got some photos of people actually building the flume, and it did not look safe at all. These guys are way up there in the sky. I'm sure OSHA was not around in those days. So, go ahead.
Do
you know what the greatest pitch was on these flumes?
You know-
Where it was?
It varied, you know. Ideally, they wanted it to drop about 27 feet to the mile, but it couldn't be done. I mean, you're dropping, you know, from 3,500 feet down to a sea level practically in that many miles, 37 miles. So some places it was extremely steep, other places it was kind of level. They did the best they could. But ideally, they wanted to do it 27 feet per mile. Go ahead.
Do you have any pictures of the head dams?
The head dam,
Where they took the water out of the...
yeah, no, I don't have any. It'd be great if I did. Yeah, I
The
don't.
engineering that went into actually designing the thing? The railroad people
Did actually built the flume, you mean? Were there railroad people?
well, who designed it, the
Well,
levels and,
yeah, the surveyors?
yeah.
Yeah, I can't help you with that, tell you the truth. I know the flume was surveyed by the guy, the route down Big Chico Creek Canyon was surveyed by Shackelford, the guy that did the 1877 Tama County map. It's interesting, the local surveyor, McGann, said it can't be done, and then the guy in the next county said, oh yeah, it can be.
I had a couple questions. What did they line it with? There was one photo that looked
Yeah.
like it was almost like concrete or gunite or something, and the other ones looked like boards.
Boards, they put extra boards in places there was a lot of wear, but no, not gunite.
The second question is what happened to all the lumber?
Well, when the flume was abandoned, and in 1907 when the Diamond Match took over, they said, "You're not getting that's just a bunch of junk, we don't want that, we're going to haul lumber with railroads." People were allowed to go up there and just collect pieces off the flume, and they built houses with them. The Rotunda Bath and Amusement Park was built from flume timber. I personally suspect that there's some fence posts in Upper Park with cut nails in them that may have come from that flume. Yeah.
What's Flume Street connection to the flumes?
That I think there was no flume that went down Flume Street. What I understand though, and correct me if I'm wrong, Dave, at the end of Flume Street is where the flume, actually they dammed, John Bidwell's original flume that powered his water wheel at his mill was dammed up. The head gate was up there at 5 Mile. And then it came down through Chico, and it crossed the creek right at the end of Flume Street. And I think that's where they got the Flume Street name. Isn't that true? Is that where you understand? But that's why 5 Mile was originally dammed up, was for that, his mill, I thought.
I'm not sure about that.
I'm not sure either, but I think that's what, I think I heard that
I
somewhere.
have heard that the Sierra Lumber Company's flume came from the big manufacturing plant there back over to Chico Creek via Flume Street.
Oh, it went directly into the creek?
Again,
Yeah.
you've looked at it more closely.
Well, you know, I can't cover everything, you know, so it's possible. Yeah, it's possible it went back into the creek too, yeah.
And
I don't know.
I had heard that Bidwell had originally had real concerns about this big Chico Creek flume because it was going to take water out of the creek and leave his mill with insufficient water to really power the water wheel to do his milling there at his already established mill. And so it was agreed that, yeah, once we're through with it over here with Sierra Lumber Company, we'll get it back into the creek above your mill site. So again, that's an interesting point, and I'm not really sure.
Approximately how many flume tender homes?
Oh, I'll tell you, early on, I read this one article where there were probably, I don't know, I'm going to guesstimate at least 15 flume tender stations, but it got whittled down to about 6 or 7 as time wore on.
How do they get the news back up to the top if you have a break in the flume?
Well,
They cut the water off.
horseback for all I know. But they had, when the flume was first put in, they had a telegraph system throughout the flume, and then a telephone system after 1882. So if someone discovered it, they just had to get to somewhere close and send a message.
Was all the lumber that was sent down the flumes cut?
Yeah.
Or were there any logs that?
No, it did not ship logs. At least our flume didn't. The Big Chico Creek flume did not ship logs. It would have been too stressful for the flume trestle work. No, it was all rough cut lumber. It was sent down to finishing plants in Chico. And then they made doors or whatever out of them, boxes. Yeah.
I spent a lot of time riding and hiking in Upper Park, and I'd love to know where that flume tender's foundation was. Take a look at that.
For which
There was you had a picture or was it a rock?
Oh, that foundation?
Yeah.
That's in Big Chico Creek Ecological Reserve. That's close to Forest Ranch.
Okay.
Right. And that's on the north side, right.
There were several
Okay.
in the park. Well, who's that guy that wrote his thesis on those ones that he found?
Oh,
Sorry, yeah.
yeah, I know what you're talking about. Yeah, there were several, but I don't know there's a lot of evidence of those left. Not like you're specifically talking about the foundation.
Yeah, I mean, are there in Upper Park, are there any telltale foundations or?
Not really. There might be some scant evidence. Now, that flume tender station I showed you at first, the first one, it was in Lower Big Chico Creek Ecological Reserve. That actually had an archaeological dig around there, so it's been kind of cleared out. So, and if you look at that photo and do what I did and match the background, you'll figure out where that is. But you just got to figure out what, what's behind it and go, oh, okay, I'm standing in the exact same spot. That must be right there. But no, the foundation's the only one I'm aware of that's got some definite evidence behind. There's some other stuff scattered around, I think, here or there, stove parts that might indicate there was a station nearby in Upper Park. But as far as the actual foundations of the houses, I don't know about any of those that are easy to find.
Did they ever have any droughts that limited the amount of water they had available for the flumes?
In California, they probably did, huh?
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't, I've never read anything about it, about being affected by droughts. But I'm sure they had some, yeah. Yeah, go ahead.
Somebody had asked about uses or, way it would win when they took them down, and I just recently read about the Chico Humboldt wagon road. They
Yeah.
talked about the rock wall that was built along there by the Portuguese.
Right.
Between 1927 and 1933, I think. But in certain places, it's stuck up, and it is really supposedly, or presumed, I guess, that that lumber.
I wouldn't be surprised. Like I said, I think there's some posts in Upper Park that are from the flume. And one way to tell is to see if it's got cut nails in it. And that tells you how old it is. They didn't use cut nails too much after 1900. Mostly if it was before 1900. Yeah, go ahead. Oops.
Do you have a location for the West Branch Mill in relation to the current Highway 32?
Yeah. I wish I could remember which one. I think it's G130. I can tell you, if you go up Highway 32 past the town of Forest Ranch, about 8 miles, F-line will be to your right. It's after a really long straight stretch. And I think it's G130 that's on your left, if I'm not mistaken. And that's the site of the old West Branch stage stop. And that road will take you 3 miles down into the canyon, and that's where that West Branch Mill is located. Yeah, there's really no evidence so much there at that spot. There's some logging camps around, but yeah, that's where it is. You can see the big flat area where the mill sat. Somebody else?
Yeah, you referenced at the early part talking about the dump,
Yeah.
but that's not the same as the old Chico city dump.
No.
Okay.
You see, when they unloaded the lumber, they just called it the dump. That was their slang term.
So would that be more in the area of California Park?
Oh, did I not mention? Yeah, where the old dump was, I should have mentioned that it was near where the Canyon Oaks Country Club is. That's where I figure it is. Right, and I should have mentioned that, but I can't remember everything, I
I've
guess.
seen one picture where you can see that it was out there for Centennial turns, very close to the park, Centennial Road. And I was wondering, so it'd be more in the area of the country club for
Yeah, my wife and I put our heads together and figured it was just right next to that golf course, next to the country club.
Thank you.
We might be off a little bit here or there, but it's generally that's where it was. Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah, a great program.
Oh, yeah.
Hold up your two books.